I'm sure all of you feel like you're drowning in technology. And now this idea of AI is freaking out more people than it is inspiring people to say, how can we adopt some of this technology into our organizations? Instead of freaking out, if you're a digitalist, you're just looking at how this can work with you. We don't even use 5% of the information we generate in design and construction for the handover of operating a building. We have all this rich information that we're all collectively generating and then not using. And so the real thing that they need to solve from a digital transformation perspective is how they have a digital twin of their company, of all of the different vendors that they work with, and then all of the different fabrication shops, and how they can deliver a quality product consistently. A lot of companies that I've worked with have never actually experienced a strategy, because a strategy should be high level, goal-oriented, but most importantly, it has a long time horizon. And so the hardest thing, I think, for most companies is when you're not in a digital environment, how can you compare strategies? People are always changing in terms of your customers and your competition. You need to understand how you compete against your peers. Being naive to technology kind of transformations and how it's going to change culture, I think that's a huge killer of great companies that have established success. And that's a massive problem, and you need to have employee ownership over direction. Digitalization, at the end of the day, is hard. And sometimes you do just have to drag your culture through change, and that's okay, but it's better if they're part of that change with you, running with you. The future will only be more complex. How are you going to solve that? You want to create your digital backbone. Ultimately, you're trying to make dashboards and accessible real-time information, and the reason why that's so important is you're able to simulate your strategies. All right, good morning. So we're going to dive into some heavy topics just to get started. If you want to get to know more about me, you can follow me with my little bio site. But what we're going to talk about is how you can actually have strategy for your company. So how you can actually plan for digital transformation. So we're going to have some main topics that we're going to dig into, like the difference between digitization versus digitalization, and then what a strategy is versus a plan, and kind of like what those frameworks are that help you execute on strategy. And then we talked a lot about culture just now, but I'll pick up on that a little bit in terms of some more stories. And then to be cutting edge or to be bleeding edge? Another big question for your company. And so a little bit about me, I started off as a skyscraper guy. So trained architect, got really heavy into BIM, loved the way that I could connect rendering to a set of construction drawings. And so it's one model, one big set of data, and I just kept learning more and more about databases. And so in the evening times, I would work with crazy artists who would want to build even more intense structures for festivals. And so this really invigorates me in the same way this next video is about to invigorate you, just in that I can take an idea very quickly, turn it into something that's an immersive experience where we can talk about how it feels, and then fabricate it very quickly. Those are super, super fun projects to work on. Way more fun than what my regular day job is most of the time. But skyscrapers are all about fabrication. You have huge expenses in terms of like what's going to be the curtain wall, what's going to be the structural system, what's going to be your mechanical and your elevator shaft systems. And so you spend a lot of time in coordination. And so I just really became obsessed with how the data transpired between all of our different organizations. And so I'm going to set a timer really quick so I don't go over. So I ended up working for Stantec and ended up on their innovation team for the corporation. And so what that meant is for the 24,000 employees that we had across 20 plus business lines, we needed to look at technology adoption between each of the individual business units and then how they could learn from each other and when it was appropriate to adopt new technologies for the corporation. After that, I led for a construction company, technology and innovation, and then I was a global strategist for Autodesk. So now my whole career is just about strategy. And so if you've heard of companies like Nexi or Nomadic, they're all into this space of design for manufacturing and fabrication. And so the real thing that they need to solve from a digital transformation perspective is how they have a digital twin of their company, of all of the different vendors that they work with, and then all of the different fabrication shops, and how they can deliver a quality product consistently. So I love that problem, and so talking about transformation in AEC 00, or the built world, we've been pretty slow adopters, like on general. So going back to personal computing like 40 plus years ago, just the whole notion of having a computer that you use for your work, we were very reluctant to leave drafting tables. And then when networks came out and we had this ability to search large amounts of information, using that like the Suites catalog, you can kind of see their reluctant process of becoming a web-based company. That was really indicative of our industry at the time in the early 2000s. And so Revit coming out in 2000, that was a really instrumental BIM technology, but we were very slow to use some of those core benefits of 4D for time-based modeling and 5D for cost-based modeling. And so now what I see is this whole collaborative space where we basically just started using real-time collaboration tools in COVID, even though they had been out for over 10 years. And now this idea of AI is freaking out more people than it is inspiring people to say, how can we adopt some of this technology into our organizations? So, other big factors that I look at a lot is just how much data goes unused on a typical project. So we don't even use 5% of the information we generate in design and construction for the handover of operating a building. It's a pretty huge statistic that we have all this rich information that we're all collectively generating and then not using. So, the developers of the world are looking at our contracting model, which is definitely kind of fraught with a lot of waste. And so leaving design, bid, build and moving into things like design, build, or integrated project delivery, those are super interesting concepts to me because that gives you some innovation time as a team of contractors, architects, engineers to collaborate on how you can deliver data-rich buildings better. So let's take in this first concept of just digitization versus digitalization. First, just raise of hands. Has anyone heard anyone talk about this before or seen it? Got like maybe 2% of the audience. Awesome. So digitizing is this idea of taking an existing process and having a computerized version of that. Or digitalize, or what a lot of people just kind of shorten to just being digital. You're rethinking your processes in a digital environment. So you're looking for digital opportunity. That's the main thing that you're trying to get out of digitalization. And so when we think about this as an application of our industry, 40 years ago, we were on a drafting table, and if you're like this AI drawing, you're drawing with two hands at the same time, and you're going to end up in a computer. And so you're going to adopt these new tools, you're going to maintain your existing processes, and then you're going to push those tools to adapt your process. So when you do that, your process is limiting your ability with those tools. So you're going to maintain your process regardless of the tool environment. So a quick example of that is looking at sheets. This was early days of A360. So when I was at Stantec, we had a sheet environment, and what I was asked to do was figure out a way I can literally make a drafting table work in the way that the same redline team was redlining their engineering drawings. So the tool's not built for this. It was a terrible use of the tool, but that was what the corporation asked us to do. So now let's re-envision this as if it were a digitalized workplace. So we would have adopted the new tools, we would have reviewed our processes, and then we would have pushed the process with the tools. So that whole thing is continuous process improvement with a changing tool environment. So this is the same platform, A360, kind of like circa 2015. And what was super interesting to me at this time is that you had a powerful BIM viewing environment that was running off a browser. That was the innovation. You did not need a heavy computer to open this huge skyscraper model that was at that time over a gigabyte in size. You could just do this on a laptop. So it was perfect for someone who was going to do a review. You kind of had a social commenting thing that you could have pinned that comment to an object. But then taking that even a step further, we had game environments that were available at the time as well. And so in a game environment, we could have taken that same model, had you walk through and immersively talk about what you thought was an issue. And what's really beautiful about this isn't this, we're using this whole XR workflow, it's this data that we're getting out of the bottom. So think about how you distribute your commentary now. So, an architect and an engineer will send out drawings as a PDF, and then one person has a terrible job of getting all of these reviewers' drawings back and then aggregating all of those comments into one PDF or an Excel file. So here we're just pushing straight from, at that time, Unity Game Engine into Power BI. So now we're able to heat map where all the commentary is occurring, and this was almost 10 years ago, so it's like not new. But I would say this is still a revolutionary idea for someone doing a hospital or a school, where you have lots of reviewers and parties that you're going to care about their different opinions. So I'm just going to do some comparisons of adoption of digitizers versus digitalists. And so let's just start with personal computing. And so the digitizer really waited until this thing was pretty cooked. So it was like post-Windows 1995. And so, the digitalists were looking at computers much earlier than that, probably late 80s, early 90s. And we're probably interested in ideas like the internet. Like that was a really interesting idea for someone who was a digitalist who was like, ooh, now I can kind of replace snail mail and look at how I can communicate with others around the world. And so then looking at networks, digitizers versus digitalists, the digitizer really waited a long time. So you probably had an office network first. You really weren't leveraging the benefits of a globally distributed kind of environment and working with other people in a very collaborative way, where the digitalists, basically the second that technology was available, it just made sense because it was an extension of those processes that you'd already started. So you keep seeing this happen over and over again. The gap just keeps getting bigger of, in collaboration, this started really becoming real time in kind of like the early 2010s. And then for someone who is digitizing, you were forced into it during COVID because it was the only way you could get work done. And so I think where this has the biggest difference is with artificial intelligence. That instead of freaking out, if you're a digitalist, you're just looking at how this can work with you, because you already know the limitations of what this technology is. So that's just a little bit there in terms of just trying to contextualize digital transformation. You're really trying to hammer in on digital workflows. So strategy versus planning. Strategy should be dead simple. It is the simplest language you can have. It's very high level. And in a chess example, the strategist is saying, I want to control the center. As someone who's trying to write a plan for playing a chess game, I'm going to play the Queen's Gambit opening. And you're totally hooped if your opponent plays the Queen's Gambit received, because now they're anticipating what you're doing. You need to change into a different strategy. So that's just a very simple way of breaking it down. Really kind of looking at it, I think, at least in my experience, a lot of companies that I've worked with have never actually experienced a strategy. Because a strategy should be high-level, goal-oriented, but most importantly, it has a long time horizon, where a plan should have a short timeline where you're trying to prove out certain things that are either working or not working, and if they're not working, you might revisit your overarching strategy. But you need to give your strategies time and energy and focus, kind of like those different things we were just talking about. So let's learn from Pac-Man. The 4 ghosts of Pac-Man were actually some of the first game theory or some of the first AI developed for a video game. And so for any of you who have played, the ghost that probably killed you the most was Inky. And so Inky he had a pincer maneuver that was a part of his programming. But what was really interesting, we can just look at it here, Pinky will be the one that gets Pac-Man. The thing that's super interesting is that Clyde was the one that actually influences Pinky to be in that location. So Clyde's goal was to chase you and then run away from you. So Clyde was really actually orchestrating the other ghosts. So if we're going to learn from the Pac-Man ghosts and kind of like their strategy to get Pac-Man, the strategy was super simple. It was just eat Pac-Man, right? It's like 4 strategies that are working together, that are flexible, and the time horizon is endless. And so what's interesting about this, for just kind of thinking about strategy, is that you have so many strategies that are available to your company, and it's just picking which ones you're going to focus on. And so the hardest thing, I think, for most companies is when you're not in a digital environment, how can you compare strategies? Super tough. How can you know where the benefits are, the cons and the pros, where your opportunity costs are going to be lost? So just as an example, we're going to pick 3 from this list. So I'm going to say we're going to focus on differentiation, global expansion, and regulatory compliance. And so in selecting these 3, something that I'm going to do and show here is that there are going to be synergistic effects between these 3 strategies. So competitive analysis is going to be super important if you're trying to expand globally and you're trying to understand your differentiation, because you need to understand how you compete against your peers. And then in differentiation, you're also going to try to understand your advantages. Where are you better than your peers? And so then you just kind of keep growing this. Advantage finding feeds competitive analysis. Competitive analysis feeds your market gaps. Your ultimate goal is dominance in certain areas. You want to find where in the world you can outperform the market that exists there. But if you focus on this, you're avoiding innovation as a strategy. And that's okay, because I think sometimes companies, you need to focus on things that help make you more sustainable, more sufficient, to kind of last through the future. Innovation is a thing I think you should always have, but it's just an example in this case where you're not focusing on that, say, for maybe 2 or 3 years. You're going to take what you have and you're going to focus on things like global expansion. So let's learn how to crawl as a strategist. So the most important thing for strategies that are a huge differentiation from plans is that you are dealing with unknowns. Like in everything about strategy, you're trying to weaponize your unknowns in that environment. So the biggest one is going to be people. And so people are always changing in terms of your customers and your competition, and you have to be thinking about how you relate to them. Emerging technology, the economy, the global events, like there's all these different things you can look at, and these are all out of control, and they will forever be out of control. So when you think about your strategy for your company, you need to think about how are we going to pick certain simple strategies that are going to help us navigate these things that are out of control, and maybe in some cases, use these things that are out of control to our advantage. So this was for a company that I worked for, over 20,000 employees, and I'm just going to bring this idea of complex adaptive systems for those of you that are at large companies. And so with this, I was commissioned to look at kind of their approval structures for how they approve technology and new processes. So in this example, there are 12 layers of hierarchy. So you can just think about the waste. If you have a really big expense item that's got to run up the chain, 12 different layers. And then you have a very outdated request form for change. So this is just going to create a huge problem. And so in our example, we have a $700 device that required $20,000 in approval time to approve. So let's just look at it. So we have Jito here, who sends an email for a $700 3D printer. Now, it was the first time someone had asked for a 3D printer in this corporation. And so everyone was just like, oh, this is just new technology, no big deal. We have a space to put it. Let's just get it. So what we then found out, just tracing the full email chain, is that it worked its way up the approval ladder, but because it had never been requested before, IT had to be involved, all of these different departments had to confer, do we even need 3D printers? And so then it turns into this huge mess. It was like over 70 emails with a lot of them at the executive level trying to learn what the hell a 3D printer is. And so I find that really interesting because one change for a request form ended up having a $2 million annual opportunity cost as a benefit for the company. So I love thinking about this concept because I never would have imagined that one change like that would have had that big of an outcome. But that's an example of emergence. So it's things that are working well and then they just work surprisingly well. And so you have an emergent idea where you're like, wow, we have a hierarchy problem. That's the thing we should actually be focusing on. And so I'm going to give you another example of emergence that might be more kind of interesting and easier to consume. So Yellowstone National Park, over 100 years ago, removed all of the wolves. Has everybody heard this story? You already know about Yellowstone National Park? We got a couple of people. So it was super interesting because what happened was there was this massive deer population problem. And so they were way overpopulating. There was nothing keeping them in check. And so they decided not very long ago to add 12 wolves to Yellowstone National Park. And so what was super interesting is that the wolves didn't even really decimate the deers that much. The wolves stayed in one area of the park and kind of grew slowly, ate some deer, and the deer just naturally depopulated because they didn't want to mess around with wolves. So in their depopulation, vegetation started recovering and then literally changed the paths of rivers. 12 wolves, super small change, changing the state of the park. So those are ideas of emergence that are just super interesting that I think exist in every company, large or small, in terms of your competitive advantage, in terms of how you operate, in terms of how you think about work. You have emergent success that's waiting for you there. So creating budgets for strategy, this is something I talk about a lot. And so starting small is definitely the #1 way that you can be successful with this. And so this is an example where you've got 3 strategies that you hope are synergistic, and you're just giving them each 1% of your net revenue. And so it doesn't have to be 1%. It can be smaller than that if you have a really large net revenue. But 1% is a good starting place. And so it's not huge. You probably waste more than that in other areas of the business. So you're just going to focus a new kind of managing principle. And so if you have billable hours, you're creating 1% billable hours for those strategies. And so you're thinking about the included staff time. You're thinking about your resource and expenses to dedicate to that. And you want to focus on these so that you start to yield bias. So bias was something that I was just talking about a little bit earlier. And bias is one of these things where it's giving you a perspective and a state of mind for how you're going to evaluate and look at technology. And so the SaaS situation, which we were talking about earlier, I'm sure all of you feel like you're drowning in technology. And what's interesting is when you're trying to really be digital as an organization, you're looking at your number of employees and the number of tools that they use and all of the data interconnectivity that they could potentially be having. So just with 18 employees and a typical set of 81 tools, you have over 400 connection types that you now need to start thinking about. And that's a massive problem if you're not a very technology sufficient person and wants to go and start kind of mapping APIs and dealing with like Whisper connections. So if you're not doing that and you want to have digital transformation, this is kind of the first problem you're going to go back to. It's like, do we have double duty tools? Same tool that does a slightly different thing, but we have an option that can kind of do the same thing and that serves more purpose for the company. So there's things like that. Those are questions you can start to ask yourself. And if you have a bias, then you can start thinking about it. So this is just Autodesk Construction Cloud, and this is actually already quite outdated. And just the number one integrations that they had for each one of these kind of main categories. And so that just being one tool in your company, if you compare that to the other main platforms that you use, they each have large integration lists like that. So just thinking about how you're going to sift through the sea of potential, that's where I really think digital transformation as a strategy helps you. So just another quick example, learning from math. Probably heard of things like string theory or loop quantum gravity, which are just examples of theories of everything. I'm not going to pretend like I understand them fully, but what's interesting is that, for me, the thing that's always hilarious is that no matter what theory of everything you're looking at, the math always checks out. And to me, that was always kind of like a profound statement of just like, well, how can that be? How can mathematicians and physicists keep coming up with these different ideas when all of their math checks out? And at the end of the day, it's really just how they start the model. So it's their starting point, it's their order of their operations, it's the bias. So what you really want to try to figure out is like what your bias is going to be for your company to guide you through what is essentially as complex as a theory of everything for your business in terms of what tools you're going to use. So some strategies that could come out of this. So just, the future will only be more complex. How are you going to solve that? Well, you got to choose a delivery platform. You've got to select some cloud partners or partner, and you need to have employee ownership over direction. And that really just means you want to try to include your culture, so not fighting you every step of the way that you're trying to make a decision that makes you more efficient. So great example of this, Sears in 1993 issued their last catalog for the business. Not even a year later, Jeff Bezos was opening Amazon.com. What's fascinating to me, these are both catalog business companies, right? Just this year, I got my first paper-based catalog from Amazon Prime. So super interesting that Sears had all of the resources in the world in the late 80s to tackle e-commerce as a new vector for their catalog business and just avoided it because they didn't think it would take off. So being just naive to technology kind of transformations and how it's going to change culture, I think that's a huge killer of great companies that have established success. So yielding a framework. This is a really important concept, so we're going to take those same 3 strategies that we had, and these are those topics that kind of came out of them, those synergies that we want to try to focus on and start to create plans from. So having strategies that yield a framework, that's what's really going to help you start guiding your planning. So let's just make this simple. We have a goal, which for every business is to make more money. We have a strategy that we've now got 3 of that we're going to try to look at in terms of our framework. So I'm just going to give you a real example from my career. We want to automate repetitive tasks. So we're going to leverage a low-code environment and a structural slab detailing world, and we're now going to have a monthly report cycle on our unknowns for each one of those topics. And so why that's important is that I'm getting buy-in from executives on here's our main goal. We want to automate repetitive tasks and save time from work. We want to leverage this one type of tool environment, and here's how I'm going to report it to you. I completed these things, and now I have this percentage of work complete versus this percentage that's not. And then within that percentage of what's not complete, here's what I don't know. And you always stay upfront about I have unknowns and knowns, and that gives you confidence to say, okay, after 6 months, we still think this strategy is a good idea. So your strategy can be long, overarching, or it can be short and very targeted in this example. So furthermore on how this applies to you. So let's say you wanted to make BIM your strategy, which a lot of companies have done over the last 20 years. The frameworks that we've gotten from BIM have been pretty terrible. So in this example, it's the full life cycle of BIM. We all sit in a part of that circle. We don't get to benefit from that information having the circular flow. So we came up with BIM levels, which was an idea that kind of made sense, but also kind of doesn't. Because you're saying for your organization, what level of BIM are you going to do? And not all projects require level 3 or beyond BIM. A lot of projects would be fine with level 1. So saying your organization is a level 2 BIM organization never really made sense to me because it was totally ignoring this huge other part of the problem of what is the efficient and appropriate tool for that project. So ISO 19650, if you have not heard of this, it's a new international standard. And it's just about creating information requirements for your projects and for your organization. So when you look at this chart, you're really going from left to right in terms of hierarchy. And you start with your OIR, your own organization's information requirements. That stuff should just be what powers your dashboards. What are your KPIs? How are you tracking how you're getting further along with your project adaptations? Are your projects on time? If they're late, why are they late? That's the kind of stuff you want to try to filter out and get in your OIR. Then when you go into your project information requirements, this has more to do with how you collaborate with others. So if you're in construction, you might say, I want to start having a value system for who I've worked with, so that if they come up on a bid in the future, we know we want to deprioritize working with that partner because they weren't good on this previous project. So that kind of information becomes your new PIR. So this just keeps moving down the line. If you're working with big gov or working on any heavy industrial projects, they've already got a lot on asset information requirements. So it's just about the things that you're buying or procuring. But I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this. This is just a framework, and we're going to use it. So here's us looking at it. So here's you. Here's your organization. You have a practice. You have information. You have platforms. You have tons of software. So let's just start thinking about how you're going to use ISO 19650 as your framework for digital transformation. So let's look at your whole org. You have an organization, you have clients, you have company values, you have professional excellence, these different things that you try to do to always stay ahead of your competition. And then you have your business units. So if you're a typical company, you probably have more than one practice area. And then for your entire organization, your IT department tries to manage all of the software and platforms that you have. So you're never in just one. They all have different benefits. And your goal, if you're doing ISO 19650, you want to connect the stuff together. How are you finding that you're going to track this? How are you going to push that data upwards so that your executive committees can review the work that you're doing, and you can start to think about, how you're performing and how you can perform better. So if you don't have that way to measure and you don't have that data capture practice in place, there's no way you can even think about utilizing this framework further. And the reason for this is because data is awesome. Like, it's just so easy. It's very easy if you can make graphs and have excellent Power BI dashboards. You will sell every executive team in your life that this is like a worthy endeavor. So we'll kind of take that as a notion and keep going forward here. So 1987, a residential tower was 126 sheets total and 38 architectural sheets. Same kind of project, just a little over 20 years later, or a little under 20 years later. You have 768 sheets, 354 architectural. And the only thing that's changed in this is the addition of AutoCAD. Right? So because it is easier to make more sheets, you are making more sheets. So this is one of those things where we thought we were digitizing a practice from the past, but what we've ended up doing is creating a new problem in our digitized future. So I talk about that a lot just because something's easy, you might have an intellectual moment that you've skipped that's actually very important in thinking about, do we need that sheet? And so now I'm going to talk about a failure example with that same slab detailing project. So we were trying to just go from, you had a mathematic piece of software that the structural engineers would do this rule-based design in. So we took our strategy, putting that into Dynamo of Revit. And so it was a huge piece of spaghetti monster that we were just going to try to operate all of the different decisions that were all rule-bound. And so what ended up happening is we took what was an 8-hour per slab job and doing 42 slabs in 60 seconds. And so me thinking I did a great job, I was like, sweet, time to party. We just saved a ton of money for this company. That was not my reality whatsoever. Full-on outrage from the structural engineering department. Everyone wondering, like, this isn't right. This is about 2016, 2017. There's no way we can sell this. We have to bill hours. And so what I learned was by not having enough of that cultural influence from the structural detailing department to begin with, they had all this new fear-based reaction to it. And so culture will kill strategy, like so easily if you're not including them. And it's just one of those things where I had what I thought to be a massive success turn into a massive failure. And digitalization at the end of the day is hard. Like culture is a very, very hard piece to try to include and manage. And sometimes you do just have to drag your culture through change. And that's okay, but it's better if they're part of that change with you, running with you. So technology exists, misconceptions on use. The biggest thing is just, state of the practices of fear. If you really have groundbreaking technology and process that's going to dramatically change an execution time, you're going to have fear-based response. So including culture, there's a ton of different ways you can do this, but I think the biggest way is just have them a part of the ideation at the beginning. So they have ownership in that direction that you're going to do. So another big example of two cultures, same strategy, deliver fantastic home entertainment. Blockbuster thought their strategy would never need to be revisited or changed. Netflix actually pitched Blockbuster, hey, DVDs are cheap to mail. Let's have a digital queue that people manage. And so Netflix just kept staying with innovation. When DVDs were now kind of like out of fad and it was easier to stream, they started streaming. And now Blockbuster is just fully irrelevant. And they had the opportunity to be what we now call Netflix. So it's just that same idea of, same strategy, different adaptation to tools. So this was the Gartner hype curve. We referenced it earlier. What you see is on the right, our current status, 2023. And this was just 5 years ago. And so what I want to talk about is that there's this idea of a line of bleeding edge versus cutting edge. And for most of your companies, if you are a service-based practice, you want to be to the right. You want to be on cutting edge technology side, not bleeding edge. That's the role of a technology company. They are going to innovate something that is then going to scale much greater than a service-based company could. And so things that are hilarious to look at now is like mixed reality, augmented reality. They're still over here. Like they're not even mentioned in the Gartner hype curve now, but we still have not even hit the plateau of productivity yet. So I think they're on the right side of that line. It's now cutting edge technology, but if you're using it, when I was using it back before 2015, it was definitely bleeding edge tech. So another little story, 1989. This is the year that we published the World Wide Web as a protocol. And there was a company called General Magic. Who in here has heard of General Magic? Awesome, nobody. So what's cool about this, they invented so many things that we now must have for mobile technology. And that's just your cell phone in your pocket now. So the USB, soft modem, streaming, ASICs, it's just ridiculous what they invented in 4 years. And you'd think they'd been super successful launching a smartphone in 1995, but they were not. So this is Eric Hertzfeld. He used to work at Apple in the mid-'80s and then left to make this smartphone. And 1995 was just way too early. Like wireless communication as a concept was still just mind-blowing to most people. 12 years later, Steve Jobs reveals a better-looking device, but a same capability device, but now the public is ready for it. So that's really this notion that I'm trying to describe of to bleed or not to bleed. It's where you want to be on the hype curve. And so if we're looking at the very first Gartner hype curve, which did come out in 1995, that's where General Magic kind of got grouped. Super, super high on the curve. And then you have, in 2007, this came out just the same time that iPhone came out. And what they were calling ultra-mobile devices then are effectively what you have in your pocket now. Super capable machine, capable of being a personal computer, but it is mobile, and it relies on cellular technology. Another really interesting thing, just for the times, some of you might remember our favorite little nothing app, Clippy. Clippy now, in 2023, is ChatGPT. Right? And so the partnership between Microsoft and OpenAI, super fascinating because now we're just seeing intelligent agents actually be useful. So this is just another story like with Apple, and they're a really great company to watch if you want to see someone who just plays that Gartner hype curve almost perfectly every time. And so I've been using technology for a long time in the VR space. And so in the early days, there was the software development kits that you would get mailed to you for you to figure out how to make it work. So I made it work back in kind of skyscraper days, and then with Stantec, with HoloLens, and it's just next year that we're going to see Apple do their first release in the space. So I find that really interesting. I think it's just a really good example if you want to get obsessed with bleeding edge versus cutting edge. So let's talk about our strategy for BIM. and so kind of where it was. It all started with Chuck Eastman in the 70s, who was starting to theorize ideas about, with the advent of computing, we can digitize our drawings and have them be intelligently related to each other. And then in the mid-90s, Mirror Worlds comes out, which was the first time someone had really thought about baking in what a digital twin is and what that would mean for you and why simulation in a digital twin is so important. At that time, Lockheed Martin was on the tail end of developing the F-14, and they started doing a digital twin of the engine in particular because it was so expensive to build, and that is fully how they built the F-35, leveraging a digital twin kind of environment. Revit comes out right at the peak. Our kind of collaborative environments start coming out kind of at the slope, and I would still say we're not fully at the plateau of productivity yet. No one does BIM the same, company to company, and you have just so many different platforms you can be in terms of how you want to visualize, how you want to analyze, all of the different things that you have. And so kind of wrapping this up, digital as a strategy. So you have digital transformation. The main kind of nugget I'm going to give you today, you want to create your digital backbone. That is how you figure out how to be digital yourself. And so you have your ISO 19650 framework, which we talked about a little bit. And you're going to try to put this into your kind of organization and kind of map it where all of your data connects. And then you're going to think about different things, like how you use reality capture data is a great example. Reality capture data and BIM don't exactly jive. So if you're going to try to have BIM as your strategy, as a part of your digital environment, you need a way to address and treat reality capture data as a source of truth instead of something that you replicate. And so that's a huge thing that I talk about a lot as well. Ultimately, you're trying to make dashboards. That's a digital environment. And the future of that is an accessible real-time information. And the reason why that's so important is you're able to simulate your strategies. So I'm right at 30 minutes, so I think I'm going to close it right here. So I stay good for all the other speakers. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll call it.